Keisha Williams has always had a gift with children, but speaking fluent Korean in downtown Seattle makes her rare in ways she never imagined. When a terrified 4-year-old gets separated from his family at a crowded cultural festival, her gentle words in his native language will catch the attention of the most dangerous man in the city. She has no idea that the child she comforts belongs to Min Jae-sung, a Korean crime boss who has been searching for someone exactly like her. At 24, Keisha balanced the demands of 30 energetic toddlers at Bright Beginnings Daycare with the relentless pressure of $60,000 in student loan debt. She was practical, focused, and knew the value of every dollar that passed through her hands. Her natural hair was styled in protective braids that framed her face beautifully, and her warm brown eyes seemed to have an almost magical effect on crying children. She was driven by an uncompromising vision of opening her own inclusive childcare center, a place where every child would be seen, heard, and valued regardless of their background or abilities. The $400 in her savings account represented months of careful budgeting, double shifts at the daycare, and weekend tutoring sessions where she taught Korean to business professionals. Her Korean fluency had started as an accident, a random language requirement in college that had become a passion when she discovered how few resources existed for Korean-speaking families in Seattle. She had thrown herself into the studies, spending summers in Seoul, living with host families, perfecting pronunciation that even native speakers complimented. Now, 3 years after graduation, that seemingly impractical skill paid her bills through private tutoring sessions at $40 per hour. Her tiny studio apartment in Capitol Hill cost $1,200 a month, leaving little room for anything beyond necessities. The walk to work took 30 minutes because bus fare added up over time, and she had learned to pack lunches that stretched ingredients across multiple days. She dreamed of a space where Korean-American children could hear their home language during playtime, where families could feel understood without translation, where cultural differences became celebrations rather than barriers. What brings a woman who barely has enough for rent to the Korean Cultural Festival on a Saturday afternoon? For the past year, she tells people she's checking out where her community needs are. I need to see which families might want my future childcare services, she explains to anyone who asks. But honestly, the festival makes her feel less alone in a city where she sometimes feels invisible. The festival sprawled across Seattle Center, vibrant banners fluttering in the October breeze, the air thick with the scents of kimchi, bulgogi, and sweet hotteok. Families clustered around food stalls while children in traditional hanbok dresses ran between the booths, their laughter mixing with the sounds of traditional drums and modern K-pop performances. Keisha moved through the crowd slowly, practicing phrases under her breath, noting which vendors spoke English and which seemed to struggle with customers who could not understand Korean. She had been observing a booth selling handmade hair accessories when she heard it. Crying that was not the ordinary fussing of a tired child, but the desperate, terrified sobbing of someone utterly lost. She turned toward the sound and saw him, a small boy who could not have been older than 4, standing frozen beside a busy walkway as hundreds of people flowed around him like water around a stone. He wore a bright blue sweater and tiny dark jeans, his black hair falling into eyes that were wide with panic. His face was red from crying, and his small hands clutched at the air as if reaching for someone who was not there. The crowd ignored him, too focused on their own festival experience to notice one small child in distress. Keisha did not hesitate. She approached slowly, crouching down to his eye level so she would not appear threatening. The moment she spoke, her voice gentle and clear in perfect Korean, his sobbing stopped. "Where is your family, little one?" she asked in Korean, her tone the same one she used to comfort upset children at the daycare. The boy stared at her with surprise, his tears still flowing, but his breathing starting to slow. He tried to speak, but only hiccups emerged. She could see the relief in his expression at hearing his native language, at finally encountering someone who might understand him. "What is your name?" she continued in Korean, reaching into her purse for the pack of tissues she always carried. "My name is Keisha. I help children who are lost." "Sujin," he whispered, accepting the tissue and wiping his nose. His voice was hoarse from crying, barely audible over the festival noise. "That is a beautiful name, Sujin," she said, maintaining the gentle Korean cadence that seemed to calm him. "Can you tell me who you came here with today?" The child's response broke her heart. Jaesung Samcheon, he said, using the Korean word for uncle. But when she asked where his uncle had gone, Sujin just shook his head and started crying again. He seemed unable to explain what had happened, whether he had wandered off or been separated in the crowd. Keisha looked around, hoping to spot an frantic adult searching for a missing child, but the festival continued its cheerful chaos around them. She made a decision that would alter the course of her life, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. "Come with me, Sujin," she said, taking his small hand in hers. "We will find the security people. They will help us locate your uncle." As she led the boy toward the information tent, she began singing softly in Korean, a lullaby she had learned from her host mother in Seoul. Sujin's grip on her hand tightened, but his crying stopped entirely. By the time they reached the security station, he was walking calmly beside her, occasionally looking up at her face with something that resembled trust. The security officer, a middle-aged white woman with a kind face, immediately recognized the urgency of the situation. "Lost child," she announced into her radio. "Korean male, approximately 4 years old, named Sujin, looking for guardian named Jaesung." Keisha stayed with the boy while they waited, continuing to speak to him in Korean, asking gentle questions about his favorite foods, his favorite colors, anything to keep him distracted from his fear. She discovered that he loved strawberries, that his favorite color was blue like his sweater, and that he had never been to a festival this big before. What struck her most was how articulate he was in Korean, but how he seemed to struggle when the security officer tried to ask him questions in English. When other festival goers approached offering help, Sujin pressed closer to Keisha, clearly uncomfortable with strangers who could not speak his language. She realized that this child was not just lost, but linguistically isolated in a way that made his fear even more acute. After 20 minutes of waiting, with no frantic uncle appearing to claim him, Keisha made another decision. She asked the security officer if she could take Sujin to the main stage area where announcements were being made, thinking perhaps his guardian would hear his name called over the loudspeaker. "You speak Korean," the officer observed, clearly relieved to have someone who could communicate with the child. "That is incredibly helpful. Most of our staff only speaks English. I studied in Seoul for 2 summers, Keisha explained, lifting Sujin up so he could see over the crowd. "I work with children, so I know how frightening this must be for him." As they walked toward the main stage, Sujin surprised her by resting his head on her shoulder. She could feel his small body relaxing against hers, his breathing becoming more regular. Something about this child touched her deeply, perhaps because she recognized in him the same feeling of being out of place that she sometimes experienced herself. What she did not know was that they were being watched. From across the festival grounds, a man in an expensive black suit had been tracking their movement through the crowd, his sharp eyes never leaving the woman who had accomplished something he had thought impossible. Min Jae-sung had spent 6 months trying to find someone who could reach his traumatized nephew, someone who could communicate with the boy who had not spoken more than a few words since his mother's death. And now, watching this unknown woman sing Korean lullabies to Sujin, seeing his nephew respond with trust instead of fear, he knew he had found exactly what he had been searching for. He began moving through the crowd toward them, his presence causing people to step aside without quite understanding why. His controlled intensity focused entirely on the woman who held his nephew with such gentle competence. He had to reach them before they disappeared into the crowd again. He had to know who she was. Min Jae-sung was a man who controlled every variable in his environment, but watching his nephew respond to a stranger's voice made him feel something he had not experienced in years. Hope mixed with desperate recognition as he moved through the festival crowd, his dark eyes never leaving the woman who had achieved what 6 months of professional therapy could not. At 35, Jae-sung commanded the Min family operations with the same precision his grandfather had used to build their legitimate shipping empire before the family expanded into less conventional territories. He was Korean-born but American-raised, fluent in both languages and comfortable in both worlds, though he preferred the clarity of his homeland's directness to American small talk. His black hair was perfectly styled, his features sharp and controlled, and his expensive suit suggested wealth that went beyond ordinary business success. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped not because people recognized him, but because something in his presence demanded attention. The festival represented exactly the kind of public exposure he normally avoided, but Sujin's therapist had insisted that cultural immersion might help the boy process his trauma. For 6 months since his sister Minjung's death in the car accident, Jae-sung had watched his nephew retreat further into silence, rejecting every caregiver, therapist, and family member who attempted to reach him. The 4-year-old had not spoken more than essential words since the funeral, refusing comfort, refusing engagement, existing in a bubble of grief that no one seemed able to penetrate. Dr. Chun had explained that children sometimes developed selective mutism after trauma, that Sujin might benefit from hearing Korean in a celebratory context rather than the hushed tones of sympathy that had surrounded him for months. Jae-sung had agreed to bring him to the festival not because he believed it would help, but because he had exhausted every other option short of residential treatment. He had been standing near the traditional music stage, watching Sujin stare blankly at the colorful performers, when his nephew had simply wandered away. One moment the boy was beside him. The next he had disappeared into the crowd with the silent determination that had characterized all his behavior since his mother's death. Jae-sung had immediately activated his security team, spreading out through the festival grounds. But he had been searching for nearly 30 minutes when he heard something that stopped him cold. The sound of his nephew laughing. He followed the sound through the crowd, pushing past families and festival goers with single-minded focus, until he spotted them near the information tent. Sujin was sitting on a bench beside a young black woman who was speaking to him in perfect Korean, her voice musical and warm. The boy was not just listening, he was responding, nodding, pointing at things around the festival, engaging in actual conversation. Jae-sung stopped moving, afraid that his approach might shatter whatever miracle was happening before his eyes. From 30 feet away, he watched the woman ask his nephew questions and receive answers, watched her make him smile, watched her sing softly when he became agitated by the crowd noise. She handled Sujin with the kind of natural competence that could not be taught, the intuitive understanding of childhood needs that had been missing from every professional caregiver he had hired. She was beautiful in a way that complemented her obvious intelligence, her natural hair styled in neat braids, her brown eyes focused completely on Sujin's face as she listened to his responses. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater that suggested she was not wealthy, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. When she smiled at something Sujin said, her entire face transformed with genuine warmth. But it was her Korean that truly captured his attention. She spoke with native-level fluency, her pronunciation perfect, her cultural understanding evident in the way she used formal speech patterns appropriate for addressing a child politely. Where had she learned such flawless Korean? How had she known exactly what to say to comfort a traumatized 4-year-old who had been rejecting comfort for months? Jae-sung moved closer, staying behind other festival goers, listening to their conversation. She was asking Sujin about his favorite animals, and his nephew was actually answering, describing in detail his love for penguins and explaining why he thought they were funny. This was more than Jae-sung had heard the boy say since the accident. When the security officer approached them, Jae-sung saw the woman's protective instincts activate immediately. She positioned herself slightly in front of Sujin, spoke for him when the officer tried to ask questions in English, translated everything so the boy would understand what was happening. She had transformed from helpful stranger to fierce advocate in the space of seconds. His nephew needs someone exactly like her, Jae-sung realized with crystalline clarity. Not just someone who speaks Korean, but someone who understands how to make him feel safe. Someone who treats him like a person rather than a problem to be solved. He began walking toward them, formulating his approach. He would thank her, introduce himself as Sujin's guardian, ask about her background, determine if she might be interested in a very well-compensated position. He had learned that most people had a price, and he was prepared to pay whatever it took to secure her services as Sujin's caregiver. But as he got within 20 feet of the security station, disaster struck. A Korean couple rushed up to the information tent, speaking rapidly to the security officer, pointing at Sujin. The woman immediately stood, lifting his nephew and speaking to the couple in Korean. After a brief conversation, it became apparent that these were not Sujin's parents, but a family who had heard the announcement and thought they might be able to help translate. In the confusion of multiple people speaking Korean, multiple conversations happening simultaneously, and the security officer trying to manage the situation, the woman somehow slipped away. Jae-sung watched in growing alarm as she handed Soo-jin to the Korean couple, spoke briefly with the security officer, and then simply melted back into the festival crowd. He moved faster, pushing through the cluster of people around the information tent, reaching the spot where she had been standing just moments before. But she was gone, vanished into the sea of festival-goers as if she had never existed. "No," he said aloud, his voice carrying enough authority that several people turned to look at him. The security officer glanced up from her radio. "Sir, can I help you?" she asked. "The woman who was just here," Jae-sung said, his controlled tone not betraying the urgency he felt. "The one who speaks Korean. Where did she go?" "Oh, you mean Keisha?" the officer said with relief. "She was wonderful with the little boy. Are you his uncle?" "Jae-sung." "I am," he confirmed, taking Soo-jin from the Korean couple and feeling his nephew immediately tense in his arms. "But I need to speak with the woman." "Keisha, where did she go?" "I am not sure," the officer admitted. "She said she needed to get going, something about meeting someone. She was very helpful, though. That little boy responded to her like she was family." "Did she give you contact information?" Jae-sung pressed, fighting to keep his voice level. "A phone number, an address, anything?" "No, sir, I am sorry. It all happened pretty quickly." Jae-sung looked down at Soo-jin, who had already retreated back into silence, his small body rigid with the kind of tension that had become his default state. The contrast between the relaxed, communicative child he had been with Keisha and the withdrawn, fearful boy in his arms now was devastating. He pulled out his phone and speed-dialed his head of security. "Kim," he said when the call connected, "I need you to find someone." Young black woman, mid-20s, named Keisha, speaks fluent Korean, was at the cultural festival today helping with lost children. "What kind of timeline are we looking at, Mr. Min?" came Kim's voice through the phone. Immediately, Jae-sung replied, his tone making it clear this was not a request, but a command. "Check the festival volunteer lists, security camera footage, vendor records, anything. I need her identity and location within 24 hours. "Understood, sir." "And Kim," Jae-sung added, looking at his nephew's blank expression. "This is priority one. Cancel everything else." He ended the call and lifted Soo-jin higher in his arms, trying to recreate the comfort the boy had found with Keisha. But his nephew remained stiff and unresponsive, already back in the protective shell that had been his refuge since his mother's death. As he walked toward the parking area where his driver waited, Jae-sung replayed every moment he had witnessed between Keisha and Soo-jin. Her patience, her intuitive understanding, her protective instincts, her flawless Korean. She was exactly what his nephew needed, exactly what he had been searching for through months of failed attempts with professional caregivers. He would find her. He had resources that could locate anyone in Seattle within days. And when he did, he would make her an offer that would ensure she became a permanent part of Soo-jin's life, no matter what it took to convince her. The woman who had shown his nephew that connection was still possible had no idea that she had just become the most important person Min Jae-sung needed to find. 3 weeks after the festival, Min Jae-sung had deployed every resource at his disposal in the search for Keisha. His security team had analyzed festival vendor records, volunteer databases, and security camera footage frame by frame. They had interviewed festival organizers, checked social media posts tagged at the event, and cross-referenced every Korean language program in the Seattle area. What had started as a thorough but routine investigation had become an obsession that consumed his waking thoughts. Soo-jin had retreated even further into silence after their return from the festival. The brief breakthrough with Keisha had made his subsequent withdrawal more heartbreaking than before. Now Jae-sung knew what his nephew was capable of, knew that connection was possible, which made the boy's current isolation feel like a personal failure. Every day that passed without finding Keisha was another day his nephew remained trapped in trauma. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Kim called with the information that would change everything. "Sir, we found her in the festival volunteer records," his security chief reported. Keisha Williams, 24, registered volunteer interpreter for Korean families. Address in Capitol Hill, employment at Bright Beginnings Daycare in Ballard. Jae-sung felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for weeks finally releasing. Continue surveillance, he ordered. I want to understand her routine, her character, her situation before I make contact. And Kim, I want to observe her myself. For the next week, Jae-sung learned everything there was to know about Keisha Williams. She lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment that cost more than half her monthly income. She walked to work every morning, catching the bus only when Seattle's persistent rain made walking impractical. She worked 10-hour days at the daycare, then tutored Korean language students in the evenings, often not returning home until after 9 at night. Her financial situation was worse than he had initially suspected. His background check revealed student loans that exceeded her annual salary, medical debt from a broken arm the previous year, and a credit score that suggested she was barely keeping her head above water. She had no family in Seattle, no apparent romantic relationship, and no assets beyond a 12-year-old Honda that needed repairs she could not afford. But watching her work confirmed every impression he had formed at the festival. At Bright Beginnings Daycare, she moved through her responsibilities with quiet competence, speaking to the children in whatever language comforted them most. She had Korean conversations with 2 children whose parents struggled with English, Spanish exchanges with others, and English that adjusted its complexity based on each child's understanding. She was a natural teacher, patient and intuitive, exactly the kind of caregiver Soo-jin needed. Jae-sung made his decision on a Thursday evening as he watched her leave the daycare center, exhaustion visible in every line of her body. She walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop through a neighborhood that was not particularly safe after dark, her awareness of her surroundings suggesting she understood the risks but had no alternatives. When 2 men began following her from the bus stop, staying just far enough behind to avoid obvious detection, his decision crystallized. He signaled his driver to pull forward, timing the approach so that his black Mercedes would arrive at the intersection just as Keisha reached the corner. The car was expensive enough to command attention, but not so ostentatious as to seem threatening, though the presence of 2 additional vehicles maintaining discreet distance probably suggested this was not an ordinary encounter. Keisha stopped walking when the Mercedes pulled up beside her, every instinct clearly telling her that expensive cars did not randomly stop for women walking alone at night. She took a step back from the curb, her body language shifting into defensive readiness that told him she had experience with situations that required caution. Jae-sung rolled down the rear window, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Her reaction was immediate recognition followed by visible fear. She remembered him from the festival, remembered seeing him in the background as she helped Soo-jin, though she had never spoken to him directly. Now, confronted with his presence on a dark street corner, her mind was clearly racing through possibilities, none of them reassuring. "You are Soo-jin's uncle," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. "I am," Jae-sung confirmed. "Min Jae-sung, I wanted to thank you for helping him at the festival." Keisha remained standing on the sidewalk, maintaining distance from the car, her eyes assessing the situation with intelligence that impressed him. "How did you find me?" she asked directly. "The festival volunteer records," he answered honestly. "Your Korean language skills are distinctive. There are not many people in Seattle who speak it as fluently as you do." "What do you want?" she continued, and he appreciated that she did not waste time with pleasantries when she clearly felt uncomfortable. "To talk," Jae-sung said. "About my nephew. About the way he responded to you. May I offer you a ride home?" "I can walk," Keisha replied immediately. "Through this neighborhood, alone, at 9:30 at night," Jae-sung observed, letting her draw her own conclusions about the wisdom of that choice. She glanced around, seeming to notice for the first time that they were being watched by more than just his security team. The 2 men who had been following her were still visible a block back, and the area was not known for being welcoming to women traveling alone after dark. "5 minutes," she said finally. "Just a conversation." Jae-sung nodded to his driver, who immediately got out to open the door for her. As Keisha slid into the leather seats, he noticed her taking in every detail of the car's interior, the custom fixtures, the privacy partition, the obvious expense of every surface. She was calculating, trying to understand what kind of man could afford this level of luxury and why he would be interested in her specifically. "Your Korean is remarkable," he began as the car pulled away from the curb. "Where did you study?" "University of Washington," Then 2 summers in Seoul, Keisha replied, still maintaining careful distance in the spacious rear seat. I lived with host families, studied at Yonsei University. Why Korean? Jae-sung asked, genuinely curious about her motivation. There are a lot of Korean families in Seattle who need services in their language, she explained. Children especially. I wanted to be able to help kids who felt lost between two cultures. Her answer revealed something important about her character, something that went beyond professional ambition to genuine concern for others. This was not someone who had learned Korean for resume enhancement, but someone who had recognized a community need and dedicated years to addressing it. Sujin has not spoken more than a few words since his mother died 6 months ago, Jae-sung said, watching her reaction carefully. The festival was the first time I have seen him truly communicate with anyone. Keisha's expression softened immediately, her maternal instincts overriding her wariness. He seemed very sad, she said quietly, but also very intelligent. He understood everything I said, even complex questions. He has been rejecting every caregiver, every therapist, every family member who tries to help him, Jae-sung continued. But you reached him in minutes. I think he needed someone who could speak his language without making him feel different for needing it, Keisha observed. Sometimes children shut down when they feel like they cannot express themselves properly. Her insight was exactly what he had hoped to hear. Confirmation that she understood not just Korean language, but the cultural complexity of raising a bicultural child in trauma. She was not just a caregiver, but someone who could help Sujin navigate the intersection of his Korean heritage and American present. I would like to discuss a proposition with you, Jae-sung said as the car approached her apartment building. An opportunity that might benefit both of us. Keisha's wariness returned immediately. What kind of opportunity? She asked. The kind that requires more than a 5-minute conversation to explain properly, he replied, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket. The card was expensive, cream-colored paper with embossed lettering that listed his name and a phone number, nothing else. She took the card but did not look at it, keeping her attention focused on his face. What kind of business are you in, Mr. Min? She asked. Import and export, he replied, which was technically accurate even if it did not encompass the full scope of his family's operations. I am also Sujin's guardian, which has become my primary concern since his mother's accident. The car stopped in front of her building, and the driver immediately moved to open her door. Keisha hesitated before getting out, clearly torn between curiosity about his proposition and instinct that told her this man represented complications she could not afford. Think about it, Jae-sung said as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Call me when you are ready to hear what I am offering. She looked down at the business card in her hand, then back at his face through the open car door. Why me specifically? She asked. Because you gave my nephew something that no one else has been able to provide, he answered simply. Hope. Keisha stepped back as the driver closed the door, and Jae-sung watched through the rear window as she stood on the sidewalk, business card in hand, watching the Mercedes disappear into Seattle traffic. She would call. He was certain of it. The question was whether her need for financial stability would override her instincts about the danger he represented. Either way, he had planted the seed. Now he would wait for her to make the choice that would bring her into his world permanently. Keisha called the number on Min Jae-sung's business card 3 days later, after 72 hours of turning the cream-colored paper over in her hands and calculating exactly how desperate her financial situation had become. Her rent was due in 2 weeks, her car needed repairs she could not afford, and her student loan payment had increased again. When his assistant answered and scheduled her for a meeting at his downtown office, she told herself she was just gathering information, not committing to anything. The building directory listed Min International Shipping on the 32nd floor, and the elevator ride gave her time to steel herself for whatever proposition awaited. The reception area was all marble and leather, expensive art on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Everything whispered of wealth and power in a way that made her acutely aware of her department store clothes and worn shoes. Mr. Min will see you now, the receptionist said, gesturing toward double doors made of dark wood that probably cost more than Keisha's annual salary. Jae-sung's private office was designed to impress and intimidate. The massive desk was positioned to catch natural light from the windows, leather-bound books lined custom shelves, and original artwork suggested taste that extended far beyond business success. He stood when she entered, his expensive charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his presence filling the space with controlled authority. "Please sit," he said, indicating one of two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "Thank you for coming." Keisha settled into the chair, noting how the leather was butter soft, how everything in the room spoke of money that existed on a scale she had never encountered personally. She kept her purse in her lap, her posture straight, determined not to be overwhelmed by the obvious wealth display. "You mentioned an opportunity," she began, preferring directness to small talk. "I did," Jae-sung confirmed, moving around the desk to sit in the chair beside hers rather than maintaining the formal distance of sitting behind it. "It concerns my nephew and your unique qualifications to help him." He reached for a folder on his desk and opened it to reveal photographs of Sujin. The images showed a beautiful child with intelligent eyes, but even in pictures, Keisha could see the sadness that seemed to permeate his small features. "Sujin has been in my care since his mother's death in February," Jae-sung explained. "The trauma has affected him severely. He does not speak, does not engage with caregivers, does not respond to therapy. Until the festival, I believed he might never recover his ability to connect with others." Keisha studied the photographs, remembering the responsive, communicative child she had met that day. "What kind of help are you looking for?" she asked. "I want you to become his full-time caregiver," Jae-sung said directly. "Live-in nanny, cultural liaison, whatever title makes you comfortable. Your job would be to help him heal." The directness of the offer surprised her. She had expected something more gradual, a request for occasional babysitting or tutoring sessions. "I already have a job," she replied. $80,000 per year. Jae-sung continued, as if she had not spoken. "Plus benefits, housing, and an education fund that would eliminate your student loan debt entirely." The numbers hit her like cold water. 80,000 was nearly triple her daycare salary, and the student loan elimination alone represented more money than she could earn in 2 years of her current job. She felt her heart begin to race, her mind immediately calculating what that kind of financial security would mean. "The position requires live-in availability," he continued. "You would have private quarters in my home, your own entrance, complete privacy when not working. Sujin's care would be your primary responsibility, but I would also appreciate having someone who could facilitate communication with Korean-speaking business associates when necessary." Keisha forced herself to focus on the practical concerns rather than the overwhelming dollar amounts. "What exactly would my responsibilities include?" she asked. "Daily care for Sujin, meals, activities, educational support, emotional comfort. He needs someone who can speak to him in Korean when he is upset, someone who understands both cultures he is navigating. I travel frequently for business, sometimes for days at a time. You would be his primary guardian during those periods." The scope of the responsibility was significant, essentially asking her to become a surrogate parent to a traumatized 4-year-old. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "There must be other Korean speakers in Seattle." "Because you have something that cannot be taught," Jae-sung replied. "You have the instinct for what children need. I watched you with him at the festival. You did not just translate his words, you understood his heart." His answer touched something deep in her chest, recognition of skills she possessed but had never heard described so directly. She thought about the children at Bright Beginnings who sought her out when they were hurt or scared, how her Korean students always seemed to progress faster than expected. "What are the terms?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 1-year commitment minimum, Jae-sung said. "Absolute discretion regarding my family and business affairs. Loyalty to Sujin's well-being above all other considerations. If you choose to leave before the year is complete, you forfeit the education fund, though you keep everything else earned to that point. And if I betray your trust," Keisha said, sensing there was more to the consequences than he had stated, "then you would discover that I protect what matters to me with the same intensity that I pursue what I want." He replied, his tone remaining pleasant while his meaning became crystal clear. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. This man had resources to make her life very difficult if she crossed him. She looked at the photographs of Sujin again, remembering his small hand in hers, the way he had relaxed against her shoulder. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Jae-sung agreed. "But I should mention that I have already run a background check, contacted your current employer, and verified your qualifications. Ms. Henderson at Bright Beginnings speaks very highly of your work with the children." The fact that he had already investigated her should have been alarming, but instead she found herself impressed by his thoroughness. He was not making this offer impulsively. He had researched, planned, and come to the conclusion that she was exactly what he needed. "You have 24 hours to decide," he continued. "If you accept, you would start immediately. I have already arranged for your student loans to be paid in full upon signing the employment contract." Keisha stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering. Financial freedom, the ability to help a child who clearly needed her, work that would utilize every skill she had developed over years of study and experience. The opportunity was everything she could have dreamed of, which was exactly why it felt dangerous. "What are you not telling me?" she asked directly. "That this job will change your life in ways you cannot anticipate," Jae-sung replied with surprising honesty. "That working for my family means entering a world that has different rules than the one you currently inhabit. That once you become part of Sujin's life, leaving will be more complicated than simply submitting a resignation letter." His answer confirmed what her instincts had been telling her from the moment his expensive car had pulled up beside her on the street. This man was not just wealthy, he was powerful in ways that existed outside normal business success. Taking this job would mean accepting his protection, but also his control. She thought about her studio apartment with its peeling paint and broken heater. She thought about her student loan payments that consumed more than half her income. She thought about walking home alone through unsafe neighborhoods because she could not afford reliable transportation. She thought about Sujin's sad eyes in the photographs and the way he had trusted her so completely at the festival. Maybe financial security was worth the risk. Maybe helping a traumatized child was worth entering a world she did not fully understand. Maybe some opportunities only came once, and turning them down meant accepting a lifetime of struggle. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow," Jae-sung replied, satisfaction evident in his dark eyes. "I will have my assistant arrange for your belongings to be moved to your new quarters. Welcome to the family, Miss Williams." As she shook his hand, Keisha realized she had just made the most important decision of her life. She could only hope it would prove to be the right one. The Min family compound was not merely a house, but a fortress disguised as a palace. Located in the exclusive Highlands neighborhood, the estate sprawled across 5 acres of manicured grounds behind walls that looked decorative but housed sophisticated security systems. Keisha's private quarters occupied the entire 3rd floor of the guest wing, with her own entrance, a sitting room larger than her former apartment, and windows that overlooked gardens designed for both beauty and strategic visibility. Her first morning in the main house, she understood that she had entered a world where wealth operated on a completely different scale than anything she had previously encountered. The kitchen alone was larger than most restaurants, equipped with commercial-grade appliances and staffed by a housekeeper who spoke fluent Korean and prepared meals that accommodated both American and traditional preferences. When Keisha asked about grocery shopping for Sujin's meals, the housekeeper looked confused until she explained that she preferred to select the child's food personally. Sujin's room was a study in careful preparation for a child who might never use most of what it contained. Educational toys remained unopened. Korean children's books sat unread on custom shelves. Art supplies waited in organized containers that suggested hope rather than expectation. The boy himself spent most of his time sitting by the window that faced the garden, watching birds with the same detached interest he showed everything else. The breakthrough did not happen immediately. For the first month, Keisha established routines that honored Sujin's need for predictability while gently introducing interactions in Korean. She read to him whether he responded or not, sang lullabies during his afternoon rest time, and spoke to him constantly in both languages about ordinary things: the weather, the colors of flowers outside, the names of birds they observed together. Slowly, incrementally, she noticed small changes. Sujin began sitting closer to her during story time. He started watching her face when she sang rather than staring out the window. When she asked simple questions in Korean, he would nod or shake his head instead of remaining completely unresponsive. The first real breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon in November, 2 months after her arrival. Sujin had been particularly withdrawn that day, refusing meals, turning away from books, curling up on his bed in a way that suggested the kind of sadness that went beyond ordinary childhood moods. Keisha sat beside him and began humming the Korean lullaby that had comforted him at the festival, the same melody that had first connected them. Soo-jin turned toward her, his dark eyes filled with tears he had been holding back. In a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke his first complete sentence since his mother's death. "I miss Yama," he said in Korean, using the intimate word for mother that children used when they felt safe. Keisha's heart clenched with recognition of his pain, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I know you do," she replied gently in Korean. "She was very special. You can tell me about her whenever you want." And then, as if a dam had finally broken, Soo-jin began to talk. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence, he shared memories of his mother, described games they had played together, asked questions about where people went when they died. For an hour, they sat together on his small bed while he processed grief that had been locked inside him for months. Jae-sung found them there when he returned from work, his nephew curled against Keisha's side as she answered his questions about heaven in both Korean and English. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his usually controlled expression showing raw emotion as he listened to Soo-jin's voice for the first time since the funeral. "He loves penguins because Iyama said they were funny when they walked," Soo-jin was explaining to Keisha in Korean. "She promised to take me to see real ones at the aquarium, but then she had to go to heaven instead." Jae-sung stepped into the room, his movements careful not to disturb the delicate moment. Soo-jin looked up at his uncle and, for the first time since the accident, spoke to him directly. "Uncle Jae-sung, can we go see the penguins now? Iyama would want me to see them." "Of course," Jae-sung replied, his voice slightly hoarse. "We will go this weekend. All three of us." That evening, after Soo-jin had fallen asleep, Jae-sung found Keisha in the kitchen preparing tea. She was still processing the emotional weight of the boy's breakthrough, still feeling the responsibility of being the person he had chosen to trust with his deepest pain. "Thank you," Jae-sung said simply, but the words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. "He needed time," Keisha replied, "and someone who could understand when he was ready to talk." "You gave him back his voice," Jae-sung continued. "I was beginning to think he might never speak again. He was never going to speak to people who made him feel like there was something wrong with him for being sad," Keisha observed. "Children need permission to grieve, not pressure to get over it." Her insight into childhood trauma impressed him, but it was her genuine care for Soo-jin that had begun to shift something fundamental in how he viewed her. She was no longer just an employee providing services, but someone who had become essential to his family's well-being. Over the following weeks, their evening conversations became routine. After Soo-jin went to sleep, they would sit in the kitchen or the library, discussing his progress, sharing observations about his needs, planning activities that might help him continue healing. These conversations revealed sides of both their personalities that had nothing to do with their formal employer-employee relationship. Keisha discovered that Jae-sung was surprisingly domestic for someone with wealth that could purchase any service. He often cooked dinner himself when he was home, preferring simple Korean dishes that reminded him of his childhood. He checked on Soo-jin every night before his own bedtime, adjusting blankets and leaving small gifts on the nightstand for the boy to discover in the morning. Jae-sung, in turn, learned that Keisha's competence with children extended far beyond language skills. She understood childhood development in ways that suggested natural instinct combined with deliberate study. She could predict Soo-jin's emotional needs before he expressed them, redirect his anxiety before it became overwhelming, and celebrate his small victories in ways that encouraged further progress. The conversation that changed everything happened on a December evening when Soo-jin had asked particularly difficult questions about death and whether his mother could see him from heaven. Keisha had handled his concerns with gentle honesty, but the emotional weight had left her subdued during dinner. "You did well with him today," Jae-sung observed as they cleaned up the kitchen together. "It is hard," Keisha admitted. "He is carrying so much pain for someone so small. Tell me about your sister," she continued after a moment. "He mentions her sometimes, but I do not want to push if it is too difficult." Jae-sung was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same vulnerability that Soo-jin showed when he talked about missing his mother. "Minyoung was everything good about our family," he said, staring out the kitchen window into the darkness. 3 years younger than me, but infinitely wiser about what mattered. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help children the way you help them. She would have loved watching you with Sujin. What happened? Keisha asked gently. Drunk driver, Jae-sung replied. She was coming home from Sujin's daycare pickup when someone ran a red light. The other driver walked away without a scratch. She died in the hospital 2 hours later. Keisha could hear the guilt beneath his grief, the weight of responsibility that came with being the surviving guardian. I am sorry, she said. She sounds like she was wonderful. She was, Jae-sung confirmed. And I failed her. I was so focused on building the business, expanding our operations, securing our family's position, that I never made time for the things she valued. I missed Sujin's first words, his first steps, every milestone because I was always working. Now she is gone, and I have to learn how to be what he needs without her guidance. The admission revealed the source of his desperation to help his nephew, the way personal loss had motivated his determination to find the right caregiver. Keisha understood now that hiring her was not just about Sujin's healing, but about Jae-sung's own need to honor his sister's memory. You are doing better than you think, she told him. He feels safe with you. That is the foundation for everything else. Only because you taught him how to trust again, Jae-sung replied. Before you came, he looked at me like I was a stranger who happened to share his DNA. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple car doors slamming outside, followed by the low chime that indicated someone had approached the main gate. Jae-sung's entire demeanor changed instantly, his relaxed posture shifting to alert tension as he pulled out his phone. Stay here, he said, his voice carrying the authority she had heard in their first meeting. Do not go upstairs until I tell you it is safe. What is happening? Keisha asked, but he was already moving toward the hallway where she knew his office was located. Within minutes, the house filled with people she had never seen before, men in expensive suits who moved with military precision, speaking in rapid Korean into earpieces. The security system activated with a series of electronic tones, and she heard the sound of steel reinforcements sliding into place over the windows. Jae-sung returned to the kitchen 20 minutes later, his expression grim but controlled. We need to go upstairs and check on Sujin, he said. Then I need to explain some things about the family business that I had hoped would never become relevant to your position. As they walked through the house, toward the main staircase, Keisha realized that the fairy tale was over. She was no longer just a nanny in a wealthy household, but someone whose safety had become connected to whatever dangers threatened the Min family. The protection she had accepted along with the generous salary was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, when rival families had calculated that security would be at its lowest point. Keisha woke to the sound of alarms and automatic systems engaging, steel barriers sliding into place with mechanical precision. She grabbed her robe and ran towards Sujin's room, finding him sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear, but not crying. It is okay, she told him in Korean, lifting him into her arms. Uncle Jae-sung will keep us safe. Jae-sung appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his expression controlled but dangerous in a way she had never seen before. Stay in this room, he ordered. Do not leave for any reason. My men are positioned throughout the house. What is happening? Keisha asked, though part of her already understood. The Park family has decided that taking what belongs to me will send the message they want about territory and respect, Jae-sung replied, his voice cold with fury. They miscalculated. He crossed the room to a panel hidden behind Sujin's bookshelf, entering a code that revealed communications equipment. The house is secure, he spoke into the device. Initiate Protocol 7. Full response authorized. Keisha held Sujin closer, realizing that the vague threats she had sensed for weeks had crystallized into immediate danger. Through the reinforced windows, she could see black vehicles surrounding the compound, figures moving with tactical precision that suggested this was not random violence, but coordinated warfare. Uncle Jae-sung, Sujin said quietly in Korean. Are the bad men trying to hurt us? Not anymore, Jae-sung replied, his tone gentling when he addressed his nephew. They made the mistake of threatening my family. The next 2 hours unfolded like something from a movie. Keisha stayed in Sujin's room as instructed, distracting him with books and quiet games while the sounds of conflict echoed from various parts of the compound. Jae-sung left and returned several times, each time reporting that situations were being contained, threats neutralized, messages sent. When silence finally settled over the house, it felt different from ordinary quiet. It felt final. Jae-sung returned to them as the sun reached its full morning brightness, his expensive suit replaced by dark clothes that suggested he had participated personally in whatever resolution had been achieved. His hands were clean, his appearance controlled, but something in his eyes indicated that decisive action had been taken. "Is it over?" Keisha asked. "Permanently," he confirmed. "The Park family will not be making any more territorial claims in Seattle or anywhere else." Soo-jin looked between the adults, understanding enough to know that danger had passed, but not enough to comprehend the full implications. "Can we have breakfast now?" he asked in Korean. "Of course," Jae-sung said, lifting his nephew from Keisha's arms. "Let us go make pancakes." As they walked toward the kitchen together, Keisha felt the adrenaline of the morning finally beginning to fade, replaced by recognition of how completely her life had changed. She was no longer just someone who worked for a wealthy family. She was someone whose safety mattered enough to warrant protection that involved eliminating entire organizations. The emotional turning point came that evening, after Soo-jin had fallen asleep and the house had returned to its normal rhythms. Jae-sung found Keisha in the garden, where she had been trying to process the reality of what her acceptance of this job had truly meant. "I should have prepared you better for this possibility," he said, sitting beside her on the stone bench overlooking the roses his sister had planted. "Would it have changed my decision?" Keisha asked honestly. "I hope not," Jae-sung replied, "because I cannot imagine losing you now. Either of you." Something in his voice made her look at his face more carefully. What he saw there was not the controlled businessman or the dangerous crime boss, but a man who had discovered that his carefully constructed world meant nothing without the people who made it feel like home. "I told myself this was just about Soo-jin," he continued, "about finding him the right caregiver, someone who could help him heal. But that was a lie I told myself because the truth was too complicated to accept." "What truth?" Keisha asked, though her heart had already begun racing with anticipation of his answer. "That you have become essential to me in ways that have nothing to do with my nephew," Jae-sung said, turning to face her completely. "That watching you bring light into this house, watching you love him back to wholeness, watching you create the family I did not know we could be has changed everything I thought I wanted from life." Keisha felt tears forming in her eyes as he continued speaking, his voice carrying emotions he had never allowed himself to express. "You are mine," he said, his hand reaching out to cup her face gently. "Both of you. My family. My heart. My reason for making sure this world is safe enough for the people I love to live in it. I am yours," she replied, understanding finally that everything that had brought them together had been leading to this moment of recognition. "And you are mine. Forever," Jae-sung said, pulling her closer. "I want to marry you. I want to adopt Soo-jin legally, make our family official in every way that matters. I want to build a life where you never have to worry about safety or security or whether you belong here." "Yes," Keisha breathed against his lips before he kissed her. "Yes to all of it." 6 months later, the wedding took place in the same garden where they had first acknowledged their love. Soo-jin served as ring bearer, chattering happily in both Korean and English to anyone who would listen about his new Yama and how she made the best pancakes in Seattle. The adoption papers had been finalized the week before, making official what had been true in their hearts for months. As Keisha stood beside her husband, watching their son chase butterflies among the roses while wedding guests celebrated around them, she thought about the terrified little boy at a crowded festival who had changed all their lives. She had come to help a lost child find his voice. Instead, she had found her family, her purpose, and a love that had transformed them all. The Min family was complete, safe, loved, and home.